Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Needy No More, the podcast dedicated to healing the anxious attachment style. I'm your host, anxious attachment style coach and author, Chris Ratcliffe. I've worked with thousands of people across 6 continents to end the cycle of anxious attachment through my books, workshops, digital downloads, and coaching program. I'm honored to carry on that mission here in the podcast, sharing tools and techniques, principles and practices for you to explore on your journey to growing more secure. Welcome back to the show, everyone. I know I took a little bit of a hiatus, a little mental health break. Sometimes producing a lot of content can wear on a content creator. So thank you for your patience. And I'm super excited to welcome my next guest, who I'll intro in a moment. But before I do, I just wanted to say that I made a decision a while ago that I wanted to use my platform to highlight things that were important to me personally. And as an out and proud gay man for 24 years now, I thought it would be interesting to welcome someone who specializes in queer relationships onto the show in honor of Pride Month, because even though we're recording this in May, it is now June when you're hearing this. So happy Pride Month, everyone. I'm now going to intro you to Tom Bruett, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist and trains therapists in the Bader-Pearson developmental model of couples therapy. He has a specialization in working with LGBTQIA2S+ relationships and practices in California and Colorado. His new book, which I personally enjoyed, by the way, The Go-To Relationship Guide for Gay Men, is available now. Welcome to the show, Tom. Thanks for coming on Needy No More.
Yeah, of course. I'm really glad to be here, Chris. Thanks for asking me, and thanks for reading the book.
Of course, you're more than welcome. I'm an author myself, and I do have a personal pet peeve for podcast hosts that don't at least explore the work of people that they have on their show. I've been on the receiving end of that, and it's very awkward and strange and way overgeneral. And, I'm a gay man myself, and I'm single, and I'm excited to dive into this convo as well. Before we dive in, I just kind of want to set the stage here. A lot of my audience is straight or straight leaning. And, I want to talk about some of the complexities and nuances of gay and queer relationships that folks might not understand if they're not familiar with some of those complexities and nuances that you and I, as gay men, are just by our lived experience. So let's start off with this question. How do queer relationships differ from heteronormative ones? Talk to me about some of those nuances and complexities.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And while there are some similarities in terms of what makes a healthy relationship, of course, across genders and orientations and relationship structures and all that kind of stuff, there are some unique aspects of queer relationships that do make them different. And I think, first of all, because my book is mostly geared towards gay men, I kind of chose that channel. Even though I work with the broader queer community, I really wanted to speak to gay men in this book. And so in gay male relationships, we have to think about the fact that we were socialized male in a culture that, I think we still have some work to do around gender. And so just kind of starting with that aspect of it, if you're socialized male and you're in relationship with somebody else who's been socialized male, there's a lot of complexities that exist in that kind of dynamic.
Paternalism, patriarchy, toxic masculinity, yes, of course. All of that comes up when you start talking about two men trying to build a life together in a society that makes you think that you shouldn't or that it's wrong.
That's and many of us didn't have we didn't have relationship role models. Speaking myself, when I was coming of age, there weren't, examples of what healthy queer and gay relationships could look like in the media. And not that we should be looking to the media for our, our education on what relationship structures are. But if you're not finding it at home, because many of us didn't grow up in households with gay parents or queer parents, and you're not finding it in your community because, again, if you're not seeing it in your family circle or in your extended family, it's where are the windows and mirrors? And so a lot of us look to media, and when there are no media representations of healthy queer relationships, that's another area that I think really makes it challenging for a lot of gay and queer folks.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, growing up, And I remember you talking about this in the book, your own experience with this, and I really connected with it as well. There was Queer as Folk, which I know you talk about, a little bit in terms of some of the leanings, attachment wise, of some of the characters in the show and how it really does demonstrate in a queer way what I think we saw a lot of in Carrie and Big's relationship on Sex and the City, this toxic back and forth push pull, will they or won't they, anxious avoidant pairing that so many people listening and watching are, of course, familiar with. But really, beyond that, and like Will and Grace, there wasn't a whole lot. I mean, Ellen had come out. I don't even think Lance Bass had come out yet when I was in high school. So yeah, I totally hear what you're saying there. So we've got that influence, that complexity. But what else? What's different that people watching and listening might not know about? Maybe in terms of sexual roles or some of that nuance and complexity, as well as just like relationship structure, right? Which I know that you talk about in your book, having personal experience with consensual non-monogamy. So walk us through a little bit more of those complexities too.
Sure. So for many of us, if we are socialized straight or heterosexual in this culture, there's something like a relationship escalator that many of us are assumed to be on. So you date for a little while, you get engaged, you get married, you have kids, you move to the suburb, all that kind of stuff. Once you get on it, you sort of know the trajectory of how your relationship is going to look. For a lot of gay and queer folks, that's not the case. Gay marriage is now the law of the land, but there still are complexities to actually creating a community and creating a family and, even family planning if you wanted to have children. Like, it's not just as cut and dry as it is. You can't accidentally get pregnant for many queer folks.
Right.
And so that's a part of it, which I think is actually an opportunity, because then it allows us, through the process of really authentic communication, to create relationship structures that work for us. And so, I think that's one piece of it, that we can look at it as a challenge, but we can also look at it as an opportunity.
Yeah, it is kind of a perk or a benefit, that flexibility in terms of not approaching things from such a specifically structured way, that it has to be this way and that it has to progress in this order and that these are the milestones that have to be hit. I love that escalator analogy. That's really powerful and poignant, I think.
Mm-hmm. And then if we pivot to the sexual piece, for a lot of folks, if we just think about sex ed for a moment, and I know sex ed is under attack in much of our country and much of the world, if you are fortunate enough to get pleasure-focused sex ed, it's probably going to be hetero-focused. And so you're probably not going to get pleasure-focused sex ed that is queer inclusive in most schools. Even still today, it certainly wasn't around when I was coming of age. And so we're learning about sex through porn or through experimentation, which, porn is not bad in and of itself, but it's not sex ed. And so, that can create a lot of complexity around really getting in touch with your own pleasure and what your desires are and what turns you on. And then when you end up in a relationship with somebody, it can be tricky to actually articulate, hey, this is something I'm really desiring sexually.
Great point. And that brings up another topic I wanted to explore with you that's covered in depth in your book, which is this idea of a second adolescence for queer people. Can you talk about that a little bit? I know what you mean when you say that, but when you talk about that, what does that mean exactly?
Many people, so when you're going through adolescence, typically it's 12, 13, 14, that era of your life, you're experimenting with a lot of different things, relationships being one of them. And if you are straight, you're encouraged to kind of date and have experimental relationships during that period of time. If you're queer or gay and you're not out and it's not safe to be out, you don't get that same opportunity. And so that often happens a lot later in life. And adolescence is a really important, beautiful time in life because you're learning a lot more about yourself, about what you desire, what you long for, what you don't like. And so many of us in the queer community, we have that experience after we come out. And so that may be later in life for some folks. There's some people who don't come out until they're 50, 60, and they may have, an experimentation period that happens a lot later in life. And that, of course, impacts relationships.
Of course. Yeah. There's so much trial and error that happens when you're young, right? You're trying on different hats. You're seeing how different things feel. You're learning to, theoretically, set boundaries, say no, learn about consent, all things that are important for building relationships. And yet, even when someone does come out in their teens, and I can speak to this because I came out at the age of 14 in 2001. As a freshman in high school, I pulled aside a handful of my best girlfriends at the time who I had only known for a few months because I went to a magnet school, and that in and of itself speaks to being gay, that I had made so many girlfriends in such a short period of time. But that said, even though I was out and the whole school knew, I wasn't necessarily comfortable, even when prompted by other people, to talk about my sexuality. I didn't feel safe doing so, not necessarily physically, but emotionally. I didn't want to put myself in a situation that would have been risky or scary. A lot of what was covered in the media in my childhood in the 90s was about people being beat up for being gay. Matthew Shepard comes to mind. And even though I was out and people knew about it, I didn't feel comfortable exploring that fully. So what Tom is talking about is so important because many people don't realize that even when you come out, which is a process not just for the self, but for those around someone who is queer, and that's important. I once had someone ask me, why did you need to come out? Well, because it's important to be your authentic self and for people to know that. And of course, I, like many others, was a bit late to that conversation. Other people knew before I did. And then I caught wind of the fact that, yeah, I guess I am. But that said, I think it's important to talk about this because in my 20s too, and in college, and even maybe into my early 30s, and even today in some ways, I'm still experimenting and exploring what it means to be me, as many people do. But a lot of that just gets delayed because you don't feel safe or comfortable enough expressing yourself authentically. Did I capture that well, Tom?
Yes, you captured it beautifully.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think it's so important for, my mostly straight audience here to hear about this because there's so much that even when I'm talking to family and friends who are very accepting and very queer friendly and are allies, they don't even necessarily fully understand the experience of what it's like to grow up gay and to have that kind of second queer adolescence. I want to ask you this. There's, I think, a perception in our community that there's a lot of barriers or challenges that gay men specifically struggle with when it comes to dating and relationships. I can speak to some of these personally, but I want you to lead this. What do you think some of the biggest barriers or challenges that gay men specifically deal with when it comes to dating as a single person and then being in a relationship with another man? What do they deal with? What are the complicating factors here? What do you usually see in your practice?
I mean, there's so many. I'm going to start with the idea that if you learn to hide a part of yourself at a very young age, it's very difficult to actually then connect with somebody in an authentic, intimate way. And so a lot of gay men have learned to sort of put bits and pieces of themselves to the side, and then they get into a relationship and they still hold some of those pieces back. An example from my own life, I could have sex with lots of different people, lots of sex. I couldn't talk about it very well. And, that's just one small aspect of my life, but I couldn't talk about it because I didn't really understand it myself. I wasn't connected to my own wants, feelings, wishes, desires around sex and sexuality. So then when I actually tried to connect with a partner or partners, it's very difficult. And so add that to the mix around being socialized male and the complexities that come with that. And then we add in the fact that there aren't that many of us. If we look at the population, the LGBTQ folks in general population is growing, especially with younger folks, but a big percentage of those people are bisexual. And bisexual folks can choose to be in relationships with men, of course, but if we look at people who solely identify as gay men, it's still a pretty small portion of the population. So even in your high school, there probably weren't other, out gay men and if there were, they may not be people that you were attracted to. Just because they're gay doesn't mean you're into them.
Yes, good point there. Definitely. Okay, that's definitely a big one, I think, that people should understand. What else? What comes to mind?
There is, I think, a loneliness piece that a lot of people will bring forward. Like when I see people, when people come in to see me, I do hear sometimes complaints of it just feels very lonely in the gay community. And when you have a community of folks who are marginalized, there are certain self-protections that come in place. And so we know that from the studies, a lot of gay men fall into the avoidant or disorganized end of the spectrum. So when you have people who have self-protected in that way, it's very difficult again to be vulnerable and do the things that you need to do in order to be in a relationship. And just, it just creates more and more barriers for connection.
There's a lot of insecure attachment out there in our community, definitely. I've worked with several gay men who have an anxious or disorganized leaning anxious attachment style and wanted to do some of that somatic work, trauma work, personal development work of understanding their needs, their values, their love languages, etc., so that they could open themselves up better to even being emotionally available. So that's definitely a big one that I know will resonate with a lot of people watching and listening, just because as anxious attachers or folks leaning anxious, we've dealt with a lot of those same dynamics in our relational history as well. Does anything else come to mind? By the way, I
Well,
know that isolation and loneliness is a big one because I have felt it myself in my own journey. And I do want to come back to that a little bit later, but keep going.
okay. We also know that, just recently, every year, the Trevor Project, which is an LGBTQ youth organization, puts out statistics on the mental health of queer folks around the country, around the world. It's not shocking with the way the political landscape is, but it's still, if we look at the statistics, the mental health statistics for LGBTQ folks, it is still staggeringly horrific how much depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance use or substance misuse is at play. We know this is harder for our BIPOC members of our community, and for trans folks and non-binary folks, those numbers are even higher. But when we look at gay male statistics, even though marriage equality has happened and there has been a lot of progress politically in some really important ways, there still are statistics that I don't think we fully understand yet. And I think minority stress plays a role in it. I think societal pressures, there's systemic issues at play here that contribute to that. And then there still are people, I'm still working with young gay and queer folks who come out and are disowned from their family. It is still happening in 2025. And, so I think when you add all of those complexities together, it's not a surprise that some of us struggle to actually connect and be intimate with other men or other people.
That's a great point. There's so many cues coming externally from around you when you're a queer person. And speaking as a gay man, I know this, that you're not good enough, that you shouldn't be who you are. There's so much shame and guilt that's wrapped up in that experience. And there's a quote that circulates online all the time, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but it talks about how when you grow up as a gay person, or a gay man in this instance, if you grow up presenting a version to other people that you think they're going to accept and tolerate, and that creates the safety that you don't feel you'll have if you do present authentically, or if you are vulnerable and show yourself fully to those around you. So you learn to be a bit of a chameleon. And that is a really painful experience to go through. Imagine, for instance, if you're watching this or listening to this, that you have a boss that doesn't support your relationship at all, who doesn't like your partner, who doesn't like the fact that maybe you're married or you've been together or you live together. And think about how stressful that would be to hold back that part of yourself, even just at work, which obviously is a big part of our lives. And then take that and apply it to your entire life with everyone in your life as a gay person. That's what it feels like. It's tough.
It's really well said. And, there's a quote, there's a book called Boys and Sex and there's a quote from that book that says, gay men are the spies into hypermasculinity. And it's true, because as young boys, we learn how to pass, we learn how to code switch, and we learn how, because it's for our own safety a lot of the times, before we even know what the word gay means, before we're even sexualized, a lot of us have experiences of just not being right in some way. If you are a parent out there and you suspect that your child is gay or queer or something, talk about it with them. So many people, especially from my generation, were like, oh, we'll wait for them to bring it up with us. It's like, why would you allow your child to suffer for years and years and years when, as the parent in the room, you could have introduced the conversation a lot earlier? You're not going to turn them gay or queer by doing that. You're just going to make it that much safer for them to actually express things to you when it's time.
And what an emotionally mature approach. And as the adult in the room, yes, you should probably be the one who brings up that conversation and not let that burden fall to the person in the dynamic who is looking to their parent for guidance and support. and advice. Very well said there. I want to back up for a moment and define a couple of things or give a couple of examples for folks. So when Tom talks about BIPOC, he's talking about Black, Indigenous, and people of color there. So when we mentioned that earlier, if you're not familiar with that phrase, that's what that means. Also, code switching. If you don't know what that means, that would be like, for instance, when I'm in a group that I feel super safe with, like mostly girls probably, I would say like, hey girl, how you doing, diva? You know, like my voice would be higher. I would be using different words. I would be speaking differently. And then if I get in an Uber or a taxi, I would say, hey man, how's your day? My tone is different. I'm using different words. I'm holding back. I'm switching into a more masculine version of myself in order to create an environment that I perceive as safe. That's what Tom means when he says code switching, if you're not familiar with that.
Beautiful descriptions. Thank you for adding that in.
Of course, yeah. Okay, I want to share a quote in your book that really resonated with me, and I want to use it as kind of a bouncing off point here for the conversation. You say on page 38 of the Go-To Relationship Guide for Gay Men, in sessions sometimes a client will describe more blatant forms of internalized homophobia when they claim to hate the whole gay community or say that gay men are all sluts or conceited or drug addicts or whatever. When we make blanket generalizations about an entire community, it is usually rooted in hatred and fear. That is what I often see. Internalized homophobia is usually an indicator of the deep wound of self-hatred. It's hard to be in a relationship with yourself, or anyone else for that matter, when you have such a negative inner critic in the mix. That really resonated with me, Tom. And I also think in our community, there is some truth to the fact that there's a lot of hypersexualization, that there is a lot of addictive coping happening. You know, many people relying on drugs and alcohol or other substances, for instance, to numb their experience. Maybe they don't have the mental health support that they need. Maybe they haven't addressed some of the shame and guilt that I brought up earlier. But talk to me about that quote a little bit more, about that internalized homophobia. And then maybe we can explore some of the perceptions that people within our community and maybe people outside of our community might have as well.
Yeah, I mean, internalized homophobia is so linked with shame. And shame, I think, is one of the most sticky emotions that there are out there because it's very difficult. Like guilt is I did something wrong, shame is I am wrong. And so when you think that you are wrong at your core, there's something wrong with you or off about you or not right about you, then you do look at the world through that perspective. And it's very difficult not to feel isolated and alone in the gay community at times. And there are, I hear this all of the time, that the gay community can, especially in certain big cities, can feel cliquey or can feel isolating. A lot of people long for a tribe of gay friends, and then they feel, really disconnected because they feel like they've been rejected by certain aspects of the community. And, I think kind of tying that into the sexualization piece, that's what we see a lot. Social media and, sex sells, right? And so social media is a form of marketing. And, when we look at and it's the same, I think, in heterosexual marketing. If we look at the images that women are forced to look at, and even straight men, they're not bodies that are actually sustainable for a lot of people. So then it's another layer of shame, of feeling like, oh gosh, I don't look like that. I am not that way. And so it can get directed. All of those internal feelings can get directed externally, which then makes it more challenging to actually connect with people.
Good point. Yeah, it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy for sure there, because nobody wants to keep someone around who is critical all the time, who is voicing their active hatred of an entire community of people. That's not someone that you really generally want to have around. And then they'll, of course, ostracize, and that abandonment feels really damaging and damning in a lot of ways. So I hear that completely. And yet there might be some truth to that perspective too, because at least in my experience, I feel like a lot of pressure to have sex and to talk about sex. And as men, obviously this does come up maybe a bit more than other cohorts. And this year in particular, I've been taking a break from drinking. I haven't had a drink since New Year's Eve. I'm more than 4 months in now. I feel great. But, sometimes when you go out, or when I go out and I see other people drinking and to the point of excessive intoxication or binge drinking and things like that, there's also talk of doing other substances. And then that, of course, leads potentially somewhere else from a sex standpoint. What do you hear in your practice from folks who might be in a similar position to me? What do they say?
Gay bars were the original safe spaces for queer folks. If we look back to the Stonewall riots in 1969, even before that, bars were raided. It wasn't until drag queens and trans folks and LGBTQ folks really stood up and said, no longer are we going to take this kind of abuse, that things started to shift. But I think there is still a legacy in our community where bars are the safe spaces. I don't know about you, but for me, I don't love being like one of three gay people in a room. I really do prefer to be in a community of people who I can let my guard down a little bit more. I can be more of my authentic self. Of course, I have straight friends, and that's important too. But there's something about being in a fully queer or gay space that does feel incredibly safe. I do think, kind of coming to your connection of hypersexuality or substance overuse, we know that if you're not feeling great about yourself, substances can be a way to escape. It can be a way to regulate. It can be a way to take care of yourself. If you're super anxious, you may drink more before you go to social settings because that makes you, let your hair down a little bit more. But it can become a slippery slope for some people. The sex piece, I think, the hypersexuality is the most visible, but whatever your sexuality is, it's okay. Some people have higher sex drives, some people have lower sex drives. They're all totally natural. And so I think people can, again, get into comparing themselves, and social media, I think, has not done us a lot of service in this department. But, really being able to tease out that whatever your sex drive is, if it's authentically true to what you desire, great, go with it. If you feel like it's not aligned with your values or who you are, or you're not, seeking pleasure in a way that actually feels good to you, that's the time to start doing some self-evaluation.
Yeah, also great. Yeah, it's okay if you want to have sex. It's okay if you don't want to have sex. It's okay if you change your mind. All different approaches are welcome, certainly. And that's the sex positive approach. I do think in our community, there's a perception that people are having sex all the time or are overly promiscuous. And that perception, I do think, speaks to what might be happening internally for that person. And also, comparing yourself to other people, regardless of your sexuality, is the thief of joy for a reason. People say that because it is true. You cannot control what other people do or don't do. This is the let them theory. This is detachment, rebranded. But at the end of the day, we have to learn to let that go and do what feels in alignment with ourselves. In the book, you talk a lot about differentiation, which is kind of the process of both self-discovery and discovering preferences with a partner. Can you talk about that concept a little bit and what that looks and sounds like?
I think this concept is like crucial for any relationship, gay, straight, queer, whatever, open, monogamous. This concept, I think, is revolutionary for a lot of people. So often, when you're in a relationship with somebody else, you can lose hold of who you are. The process of differentiation is about being able to hold on to connection and autonomy at the same time, and to tolerate the tension that can arise when somebody has different thoughts, feelings, wishes, desires than you do. And that is going to happen because in relationships, differences occur, and it's through differences that we actually learn more about ourselves and through our partners. And so allowing the space for that tension to exist and not moving into avoiding it or conflict avoidance or like pushing your way through to fight through it and get into those angry arguments where no one feels heard or understood, but really staying in the understanding and curiosity place is what I work with a lot of people around.
I love the concept of differentiation. It brings me back to my psych classes in college. Now, obviously, the goal is interdependence. You've got to hold a sense of self, and you need to be able to relate to others in a healthy, inclusive, compassionate way. We need other people. We are a social species. So it's not one or the other. It's always both. It's how you hold both. Differentiation is a reflection of another concept that I espouse in my work called emotional diversification. And this is borrowed from the world of finance, kind of pie chart approach, a bit more numerical, quantitative, where we look at, okay, how much time are you spending in this area of your life versus this area. And then knowing that time and energy are finite resources, taking some of those investments and then reallocating them so that the mix is healthier. And by the way, this is always incremental. So it's not like you're taking all of the time and energy that you spend with a partner and then pouring it into everywhere else. You don't want to neglect your relationship, but you do need to take some of that time and energy and then reinvest it elsewhere. And that process is done through differentiation.
Exactly. Yeah. And it is, I think, like attachment, it is a muscle that you can stretch and evolve and develop over the lifetime. And so I think attachment, and I know your work doesn't speak in this way, but sometimes people can get scared about attachment, like, oh gosh, I'm anxiously attached, I'm going to be this way forever, or I'm avoidantly attached, or whatever. And it's actually through relationships that we heal our attachment style. You cannot do it on your own. Like, it's just impossible. And so whether it's with a coach or a therapist or a partner, like you have to kind of get into the muck. And that's what I do with folks in the relationship work, is like encourage them to stay in that tension together. And the tension sometimes is somebody who's more anxiously or avoidantly attached, but sometimes it's just there's a really tough topic that people have been avoiding for whatever reason. And in the queer community, you know, there's lots of topics that are taboo, and sex or opening the relationship or whatever it may be. And so being able to actually tolerate that tension, and differentiation comes from the father of family therapy, Murray Bowen, and he really was kind of the first proponent of being able to have family systems stay in the tension together and really differentiate and allow people to be individuals inside of a family unit.
Very well said. In the book, you talk a lot about and provide a lot of anecdotes around what differentiation looks and sounds like. There are conversations that, of course, you've changed the names of the clients, but generally, you know, the conversation is intact. You're talking about how someone is opening up and how someone is receiving that. I want to ask you, what has surprised you in your work dealing with couples? Is there any example of a couple that was on the brink and was able to come back, or that you thought would make it and then just didn't? Like, what has surprised you in your work?
I think it's always a surprise to me. I'm not one of those people, and I don't think it's possible to really hold yourself as a relational therapist and say, I want everyone to stay together, or I want to have an idea of who should stay together and who shouldn't, because there are people who decide to stay in relationships that wouldn't work for me, but they work enough for them, or, you know, vice versa. And so for me, what is heartwarming is when I see, especially two gay men who they didn't have the support. It's clear they didn't have the parental support growing up. It's clear that nobody really taught them the ways to differentiate and be in relationship with somebody else. And to see them take those incremental risks with each other in the office and then start sharing more, and then their relationship shifts in ways that I don't think they even imagined possible when they first started seeing me. And those are the people that I love to work with, because it's, you know, so many of us have not been scaffolded enough and encouraged enough to stay with a relationship. A lot of people will sometimes just leave a relationship if it's not working for them in that moment. But actually, I always say to folks when we're first starting out, whether this relationship works out or it doesn't, there is no way you're not going to learn more about yourself in this process. And learning more about yourself is a gift that you can't possibly put a monetary or a time value on, because whether it's this relationship or the next one, you're going to shift the way that you show up and attach and connect with other people in your life.
Sometimes leaving the relationship is it working out for you. And I think it's important to say that. I've said it in various ways in the show so far, but it can also be an act of love to release someone if you know that you can't show up in the ways that they need. And that is an act of unconditional love, surrendering, releasing them to find someone who can show up in the ways that they're hoping for and who can accept them and work with them in the ways that they need. Now, there's always fundamental differences in a relationship that might not get resolved. They don't have to be solved necessarily, but they need to be respected. And there has to be empathy in approaching that. And that process, of course, can be found through differentiating and through having tough conversations. Now, my anxiously attaching audience, I can already hear them in my head saying, I don't want to have the conversation. I'm scared the other person is going to leave me. I'm too much. I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to be perceived as needy. These are all things that you know, and I know, anxious attachers or those leaning anxiously attached struggle with. What do you have to say to those people?
That is where building the muscle around attachment, the rubber really meets the road in that regard. And so when I'm working with a couple and that's showing up, because it will show up, even though I'm encouraging them to take these risks and differentiate, I can tell, especially for people who are more on the anxious side, that it's going to be hard. I meet with them individually. I work with them so that they can trust themselves. And then it really is about your attachment relationship with yourself and knowing that you are worth actually taking that risk and getting to the point where you're secure enough with yourself that if this person isn't going to actually be okay with what you want and desire, they're probably not the right person for you. But that is a journey. And so the people who are more on the anxious side of things right now are going to hear me saying that and say, oh, I could never say that, or that feels really out of reach. It may right now, but it doesn't have to forever.
Find someone who you feel safe with and practice with them. If you need to do it in the mirror, you can do it in the mirror. I've had clients do this. I've had them record voice notes talking to themselves in the mirror, setting a boundary or opening up to their partner. Then we review that and we edit it down until you get to the point. Many people on the anxious side of things are people pleasers, which means they over-explain. So getting to the crux of what actually is happening for you and what you need in response to that is really, really important. And that muscle is built through that practice. As I remind folks all the time, you got to get in the reps. If you want to rewire your brain, the brain learns through repetition. It rewires that way. So you got to get in the reps emotionally to do this. I want to speak to single gay men out there. Being one myself, you'll also be speaking to me. What do you have in the ways of hope to offer? Inspiration, hope to give to single gay men who feel that there's not enough options, scarcity mindset, who might live in smaller cities. Maybe they're not in a New York or San Francisco or DC or Chicago or LA or Dallas. I'm in Charleston, South Carolina. So this definitely resonates with me. How do you meet like-minded people, not at bars? And for those who might want a monogamous partnership and who might look around and see a lot of non-monogamy around them, what kind of hope and inspiration do you have to offer to folks like that?
Well, starting with the monogamy, non-monogamy thing, we know 50% of gay couples are in monogamous relationships. It is possible. There's a lot of people out there. It's about 50-50, depending on the study that you look at. We need more studies. We need more research on gay relationships. And then moving to the piece about really connecting and finding folks. For me personally, it's like use the apps for what they're intended for. They're intended for introduction, and then get off of them as quickly as possible. Find somebody that you connect with and get into real life as soon as possible. Because oftentimes the way somebody presents themselves online, and many people will resonate with this, I'm sure, they don't look like their picture, or they look better, or, their energy and their connection, you connect better actually in person. And so do it sooner rather than later. And try to go with the things that you love to do. I love to do theater. So, joining a community theater or connecting to the gay men's chorus, if you happen to live in a city that has that kind of opportunity, or a gay sports league, like go with your interests. That way, if you don't meet somebody that you connect with romantically, you're still going to have a good time. You're going to build community. There's lots of ways to get out of the bars and get out of the apps. And there are people just like you looking to connect. And it is possible. But so often what I end up working with people who are single around this with is like expanding their view of what they're looking for in a relationship. Because so often we have this like list of all of these criteria of what we're looking for in a partner.
The list, yes.
Yeah, the list. And sometimes the list there are really important things that are deal breakers and value based, and sometimes they're not, and so really getting honest with yourself. If you're looking to connect with somebody, what is getting in the way of you actually doing that?
Very well said. It always starts with you, and getting to know yourself and what you value is incredibly important. For me in my work, I teach people that that's the compass. That's the true north that we need to reorient back to. Because as anxious attachers, or those leaning that way, typically we've looked to those around us and we've been heavily influenced by how they feel, what they need, and bringing that focus back to ourselves is really important. So, like Tom said, start with you. Start with what you care about, what you're passionate about. And if you don't know that, start with your curiosity. What are you interested in exploring? Is it a cooking class? Is it a pottery or ceramics class? Is it doing vocal lessons? Is it going to karaoke? If you don't have a gay men's chorus or there aren't gay sports leagues where you live, which there's not where I live, but if you don't, start with what you're interested in and remember that meeting other people who maybe aren't even in our community can help too. Just like when you're approaching finding a job and you're trying to network your way into that job, you're only going to get so far with your first and second degree connections. It's your third and fourth degree connections, which you do not currently have access to, that are going to be really powerful for you. And that means you're going to need to get out of your immediate environment and get out of your house and off of your phone and into real life to do that and to connect with others as well.
And like you were just saying earlier, if you live in a place where there's not a lot of gay folks or queer folks, do a travel experiment. Like there's lots of actual travel groups around the world where you can travel with a group of other, like I just recently, my partner and I did a scuba trip with a bunch of gay men and from around the world, and it was really fun. And so, we got to connect with different people, and that was again following an interest. And so if you have the resources and the opportunity, there's lots of different ways to get out there. You just got to keep putting yourself out there, keep getting back on that horse.
Yes, absolutely. Anything else on the front of empowerment or feeling more secure in dating as a gay man, or even just in general, that you want to share?
I think the self-compassion piece is really important. So whether you feel like you're more anxious or more avoidant or disorganized or whatever it is, like just being compassionate with yourself around that. It's not your fault, and you can grow through it. I'm not going to pretend it's not going to be difficult or painful or it's not going to take some effort, but like you're worth it. I think so often the messages that we get as gay and queer folks is that there's something wrong with us or we're not worth it, or we're damaged in some way. Again, not everybody. There's a lot of queer joy and resistance out there, but connect into that. Like follow people on social media if you're doing that celebrate queer and gay joy, and connect to the amazing aspects of being gay. I mean, I wouldn't change being gay for anything at this point in my life, but it's because I feel like I'm fully myself and I'm connected to other people who are fully themselves. And we don't only have to look at the difficult aspects of being gay or queer. We can actually also embrace the queer joy as a form of resistance.
That's one of the reasons why Schitt's Creek was so powerful for me, I think, is it was one of the first shows that didn't have someone dying of AIDS, that didn't have this massive relational struggle where one person was chasing the other and there was this dance, this anxious avoidant dynamic, this push-pull trauma bond that many of us do tend to recreate in our adult relationships. It was a person, Patrick, who came out and it wasn't a big deal. And he was able to form a new relationship in a healthy way with David, who had been through the ringer. And that really resonated with me at a deep level. And one of the reasons why I think it resonated with so many people generally, at least in our community. There's so many amazing aspects to that show just generally. But I think from a queer standpoint, that was really impactful for me to see.
That and Somebody Somewhere is also another one. I don't know if you've seen that, but it is another one. It's based in a small town in Kansas, and it's a queer community, and they're just existing and living life, and it is so joy-filled and beautiful and queer, and it's another one I recommend folks view.
I just wrote that down. I'm definitely going to look into that. I remember sitting and watching Call Me By Your Name, the movie, and I never read the book, and just going into it blind and thinking, oh no. When they start traveling together, and spoiler alert if you haven't seen the movie, but, I was expecting, oh God, he's going to die. There's that expectation of grief that so many of us have in our community and maybe even carry with us because of the generational trauma of the AIDS pandemic. But that said, I think also seeking out healthy role models, which many of us have lacked, as you say in the book and have said today, is really empowering. It can help to write over some of that programming inside that makes you anticipate someone leaving or someone dying, God forbid, or they're just generally having to be drama or trauma that defines relationships. It doesn't have to be that way, folks. It doesn't. There is another quote that I wanted to bring up. And I don't have any question to ask with this, but I just wanted to share it with folks because it really resonated with me, especially on the note of talking about media. You say on page 177, "We have been taught through media and rom-coms that we want someone who will be able to read our minds and anticipate our every need. In reality, that's not realistic to expect from our adult attachment relationships. The fantasy of having someone in our lives who can anticipate our every need is better reserved for infant and caregiver relationships. If you didn't have that kind of nurturing from your caregivers growing up, as many of us didn't, that's work for therapy, not your adult relationships." What do you have to say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I stand by that 100%. And so often people, so many couples are coming to mind as I'm thinking about this right now, who I work with in the office, who they are pulling for that. They're pulling for healing. And again, not pathologizing that. There's nothing wrong with that. You didn't get that as a child and you deserved it. And if you keep pulling for it from romantic figures in your life, you're going to continue to be hurt. It's going to be just more disappointment. And so being willing to do the effort and kind of do some healing around that yourself, it's a gift that I'm so grateful I gave myself. And it's something that I see people time and time again grow through some of these attachment wounds and live lives that they couldn't even think possible before they started that journey.
The irony is when you kind of level set your expectations relationally and learn to take better care of yourself and to differentiate away and diversify away from your romantic partnership, you will actually usually find that that partner will lean back in. And creating the space for them to show up authentically is really important. But when you haven't addressed your shit, you will expect other people to do for you what you're not doing for yourself. And in particular, we will look to a romantic partner to try to fill the void that somebody else left behind. Of course, that void does not really exist. It is a misinterpretation of a traumatic experience, that there's something wrong with you because of how you were treated. But that said, it is also incredibly invalidating for the other person because you're not seeing them for who they are. You're seeing them for who you expect them to be in order to fit the mold that is most comfortable for you. And fitting into a mold is not the goal of having a partner. That is a project. You don't want a project. You want a partner.
One of the interventions I do so often early with couples is have people put their hand on their heart and just say, it's not about me. You know, what the other person is sharing right now, it's about them, and really differentiating and allowing that space, which, you know, does take time, and it's an ongoing lifelong process.
It really is. Yes. And I love the hand on the heart trick and saying that it's not about me. I can see people at home doing that already. I want to bring up one final topic from the book, which is about two different relationship dynamics that you name. You talk about how there are roommate relationships and reality show relationships. I think you actually call it reality TV relationships. So talk to us about the differences between them and why it's important to identify those two in particular.
So a lot of times people will come in to see me in that stage of the relationships where the differences are really starting to surface and they're starting to differentiate, or one person's starting to differentiate. And if differentiation is not happening in a relationship, that's when you can fall into one of those two camps. And the roommate relationships are people who really avoid conflict at all costs. And so they're going to, you know, sweep things under the rug, you know, very Midwestern folks, you know, that's the, you know, avoiding conflict at all costs.
Yeah, just pretend it's not there.
Pretend it's not there, which doesn't work, right? We know that doesn't work. That ends up building up resentment, and then you're more likely to have less sex. You're more likely to have people who are going out and seeking affairs. I mean, that kind of happens more in that bucket of folks. The other bucket of folks, the reality show relationships, those are the more, you know, angry fighting couples who they can't live with each other, they can't live without each other. And you see them fighting all the time. They'll go to a nice dinner and they'll fight, and then they'll make up, and then they'll go on vacation and they'll fight. And that is another way of trying to address the differences, but in unconstructive ways. And so those folks, the work for them is to be able to just slow down and understand and listen for understanding and not try to solve any problems or anything like that, but just really be present and curious with their partners. The more conflict avoidant folks, the goal for them is to take those risks and bring the conflict into the room. And it feels risky in both senses, because the people that you're in relationships with are the most important people in your life at one point. And I love your idea of diversification there. That is such a healthy kind of differentiating concept, to really allow there to be more people at your table who can fill your cup and fill your heart.
Thank you. Yeah, we're a tribal species. Y'all, if you're listening to this or watching this, we're not in a cave anymore, but our body is still programmed. Our nervous system is still wired evolutionarily to need other people. So it's important to make sure that you surround yourself with folks that you feel safe with. And if you lack that safety or perceive to lack that safety in your romantic relationship, you've got to seek it out elsewhere. And if you don't have it anywhere in your life, hire a professional that you feel really gets you, like Tom or myself, or both, because therapy and coaching are different approaches. I work with both consistently, and I feel supported in different ways in each environment, and each practitioner is different. So just make sure that you are authentic in how you're showing up when you're looking for a mental health practitioner, and that you're asking the tough questions. How do you address this? What's your approach to this? It's kind of like dating in a way. You've got to find someone that you feel really gets you. And that can even be practice for other environments as well.
Exactly.
Tom, I just want to say this has been an absolute pleasure. Before we give folks a way to find you and resources that you might have for them, any other final notes that you wanted to share regarding queer relationships, whether you're in our community and single, or in a relationship, or outside of our community, just learning about some of these nuances?
Yeah, I think if you are a queer person, or you're not a queer person, or you're an ally, like we've talked a lot today about queer trauma, but I think it's really important, especially right now, as there are more laws that are anti-trans on the books across the country than ever before, that we are also leaning into the queer joy, and queer joy is a way of resistance. And so it is not doom and gloom and loneliness to be a queer person. There's lots of beauty there. And so I just think it's important to balance that.
As I remind folks all the time, you're not healing to better manage trauma. You're healing to better hold joy. And that message resonates with that as well. Tom, how can my viewers and listeners find you?
I am on Instagram and YouTube, lots of different places, with Queer Relationship Institute is the handle for that. And then on my website, if folks are interested, queerrelationshipinstitute.com, there's a bunch of free resources there. So there are discussion cards for gay men that people can download for free, and there's a free mini communication course that people can download with some video lessons. And then I also, if you're a therapist or a coach listening to this, I also have some free resources for those folks as well. So I love to kind of give people resources as often as I can.
Fabulous. I love those conversation cards. I'm definitely going to check those out. And again, that's queerrelationshipinstitute.com. And again, Tom wrote a book, The Go-To Relationship Guide for Gay Men. My camera's blurring it out here, but this is what the cover looks like. And where can folks find your book?
It is on Amazon. You can get it from the publisher, Jessica Kingsley Publishing, bookshop.org, anywhere where you get your books. You'll be able to get it. Kindle. It's all those places.
Tom, thanks again for coming on the show, and happy Pride Month.
You as well. Thanks, Chris.